Mark appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning heavily against the frame as if the simple act of walking had exhausted him entirely. He wore a gray hoodie with the strings pulled tight around his face. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. They wouldn't meet hers. He reached for a glass of water on the counter, his hand trembling as badly as her own. "I didn't sleep well," he said, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "That's all." Elena turned her back to him without responding. She reached for a kitchen towel, but her eyes caught on something else, a loose floorboard near the pantry. She had walked past it 1,000 times without noticing. Now it seemed to call to her, the edge of it slightly raised, as if inviting her to look. She knelt down, ignoring Mark's confused stare from across the kitchen. Her fingernails scraped against the wood as she pried it up. The board creaked loudly. Inside the gap lay an orange translucent pill bottle. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She stood up slowly, the bottle in her hand. The pills inside were small and white, marked clearly, OXY30, half full. She didn't need to count them to know what this meant. 6 months. 6 months of rehab. All of it, gone. She turned to face Mark and slammed the bottle onto the granite island. The pills rattled inside like angry insects in a jar. Mark flinched and backed away toward the hallway, his eyes wide with panic. 6 months of rehab, Mark. Elena's voice rose, her control finally cracking. 6 months for nothing? It's not what you think, Mark said quickly, desperation flooding his words. I'm just holding them for Dave. I'm clean. I swear to you, Elena didn't stay to listen to the rest of the lie. She set the bottle down on the counter with deliberate care and walked out of the kitchen, her stomach churning with a sick, familiar dread. By 10 o'clock that morning, Mark had grabbed his leather jacket and was moving toward the front door. Elena stepped into his path, her back pressed against the heavy mahogany door. She gripped the brass handle with both hands, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. "You aren't taking those keys," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You are staying here." The rain drummed against the windows outside. Mark's car keys jingled in his hand. He reached out suddenly and grabbed her wrists, trying to pry her fingers from the doorknob. He shoved his shoulder into her chest, driving her backward. They struggled there in the narrow entryway, their feet scuffing against the welcome mat. Elena could feel his desperation in the grip of his hands, in the force of his body against hers. She could smell the sweat on him, sour and acidic. "Move, Elena," he snarled. "I mean it." She kicked out at his shin with her slipper. Mark gasped, and his grip weakened for just a moment. That was enough. He lost his balance and fell backward into the coat rack. The wooden frame toppled over with a crash that echoed through the house, scattering coats across the floor like bodies. Elena lunged for the car keys dangling from his thumb. Mark recovered quickly, too quickly. He grabbed her arm and swung her away from the door with brutal force. Her shoulder hit the wall hard enough to make her see stars. She slid down slightly, gasping from the impact. Mark wrenched the front door open and sprinted out into the rain toward his blue SUV parked in the driveway. "Mark!" Elena screamed after him, her voice raw. "Please!" But he was already slamming the car door shut. The engine roared to life. The SUV peeled out of the driveway, spraying water in a wide arc, and was gone. Elena stood in the doorway, her shoulder throbbing, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The rain continued to fall steadily outside. She closed the door and locked it. Then she stood there in the dim light of the entryway, coats scattered at her feet, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. A hardening. A clarity that came not from understanding, but from the complete absence of denial. She walked upstairs to Mark's home office. The mahogany desk sat in the corner of the room, facing the window that overlooked the garden. Elena pulled open the top drawer. It was locked. She found a metal letter opener in the pencil holder and wedged it into the lock mechanism. The wood splinters cracked as she forced it open, the sound sharp and final. Inside the drawer lay a stack of unopened mail, bills mostly, and beneath them, a black spiral notebook. Her hands were cold and numb as she pulled it out and opened it to the first page. Handwritten entries. Dates on the left, amounts on the right. Oct 12, 500, no 5, 200, Dec 1, $3,000. She flipped through the pages, watching the numbers climb with each entry. The handwriting was messy, frantic, as if written in desperate haste. By the final page, there was a total written in large, underlined numbers. $42,000. $42,000. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers and opened the banking app. She navigated to the house fund savings account, the money they had been saving for 5 years, the money that was supposed to be their future. The screen showed a balance of $14.12. A red warning banner screamed across the top. Low balance alert. Everything. He had taken everything. She whispered the words aloud, as if saying them out loud would make them real, would make them bearable. But they didn't. They only made her feel hollowed out, like something essential had been carved from her body and left her a shell, functioning but empty. The hours that followed blurred together. Elena sat at the kitchen table and made coffee that went cold. She answered a text from her mother with a single word. Fine. She looked at her reflection in the dark window and didn't recognize the woman staring back. By evening, when the sun had set and darkness claimed the house, she found herself sitting in the living room with no memory of how she had gotten there or what she had been doing for the past several hours. At 10 o'clock that night, she decided to follow him. The Rusty Cage was a bar on the south side of the city, the kind of place that attracted people who didn't want to be found. The parking lot was half empty when Elena pulled her car into a space near the back. She watched the neon sign through the windshield, its red glow casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Mark's blue SUV was parked near the entrance. She waited. At 10:30, Mark emerged from the bar, moving with purpose toward the alley behind the building. Elena got out of her car and followed him, keeping to the shadows. She crouched behind a dumpster as Mark took position under a buzzing yellow light. A man in a camouflage jacket emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by a black beanie. Elena held her breath. Mark handed over a stack of bills. The man counted them slowly, methodically. Then his face changed. His expression hardened into something dangerous and cold. He grabbed Mark by the front of his hoodie and pulled him close. The hand that came out of his waistband held a small, snub-nosed revolver. He pressed the barrel against Mark's throat. Elena's hands covered her mouth to stifle her gasp. "You're 50 short, junkie," the man growled. The barrel pressed harder. "You think I'm a charity?" Mark was choking, his face turning deep red, his hands fluttering uselessly at the man's grip. Elena moved on instinct, not thought. She grabbed a heavy glass beer bottle from the trash nearby, the green label half torn away, the mouth still smelling of stale beer. She sprinted out from behind the dumpster and swung it with all the force she could summon. The bottle connected with the back of the man's skull with a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. It shattered. Brown glass flew through the air, catching the light from the neon sign in 1,000 bright, horrible fragments. The man fell to his knees, screaming. Blood leaked from his scalp in a thick rivulet. Mark grabbed the revolver and the plastic baggie the man had dropped. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide with shock, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Then Elena grabbed his hand and pulled him toward her car at the end of the alley. "Get in the car! Now!" she screamed. They made it 3 blocks before Elena pulled into a hospital parking lot. She killed the engine and sat there, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. Her clothes were spattered with the dealer's blood. Mark was silent beside her, the revolver on his lap and the baggie in his shaking hand. "Why would you do that?" he whispered over and over, as if the question could undo what had just happened. "Why would you do that?" Elena didn't answer. She sat in the darkness and wondered the same thing. 20 minutes later, Mark's breathing changed. It became shallow, erratic. His head rolled back against the seat. Elena shook him, called his name, but his eyes were rolling back into his head. His body began to convulse. An overdose. Elena grabbed the baggie from his lap. It wasn't filled with cocaine or heroin. It was pills. Dozens of them. Oxys, fentanyl patches, maybe more. He had swallowed half of them already. She threw the phone into her purse and pulled into the emergency room entrance, screaming for help the moment she stopped the car. The next 3 hours passed in a fluorescent-lit haze. The waiting room at County General was filled with the detritus of a Friday night. Drunk college students, an elderly woman with a hacking cough, a man with a bandaged head. Elena sat in a plastic orange chair, her hands stained with the dealer's blood, watching the clock on the wall tick away the minutes. A woman sat down next to her and handed her a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. It was Sarah, Mark's younger sister. "Is he going to make it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Elena didn't answer. She stared at the coffee cup, watching the steam rise and dissipate into nothing. Sarah pulled a necklace out from under her shirt. It was a silver locket. She opened it to reveal a photograph of a man who looked almost exactly like Mark. The same sharp jawline, the same dark eyes. But beneath the photo was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Drug Raider Killed in Shootout." "That's our father," Sarah said quietly. "He died 14 years ago. Mark was 12. She paused, her finger trembling as she pointed to the photo. "I need you to understand something, Elena. He's not just using. He's taking over Dad's old business. He's not a victim. He's the supplier." Elena turned slowly to look at her. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "What are you saying?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. She had known it from the moment she found the ledger, from the moment she saw the amounts climbing month after month. "I'm saying," Sarah whispered, "that Mark chose this. He chose to become Dad." The words hung in the air between them like a curse. By 6 in the morning, Mark had been stabilized. The doctors said he was lucky. The fentanyl had been strong enough to kill, but not quite in the doses he'd ingested. He would live. He would wake up. He would face whatever came next. Elena sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed and watched him sleep. His breathing assisted by machines, his arms wrapped in bandages from where they'd inserted IV lines. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel anything at all. She drove home as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The house was quiet when she entered it, all the coats still scattered across the floor in the entryway. She stepped over them and went downstairs to the basement. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet. She carried an industrial flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the accumulated detritus of years. Old boxes, Christmas decorations in plastic containers, tools that hadn't been used since before they married. She moved deeper into the basement, following an instinct she didn't want to examine. The Christmas decorations were stacked against a shelving unit along the far wall. Elena pulled the unit aside, It scraped against the concrete floor with a sound like a groan. Behind it, the wall had been partially removed, creating a false wall and a hidden space. 6 large black duffel bags sat in the darkness. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She approached them slowly, as if they might explode. She unzipped the first one with shaking fingers. Inside were dozens of vacuum-sealed bricks of white powder, stacked neatly in rows. She didn't need to taste it or test it to know what it was. Cocaine. Kilos and kilos of it. Taped to the top was a list of names. She pulled it free and read it by the flashlight's beam. Local police officers, bank managers, a city council member. Dollar amounts written next to each name in Mark's distinctive handwriting. Elena sat down hard on the concrete floor and began to sob. She called the police from her car, driving away from the house without really knowing where she was going. She told them she had information about a drug operation. She told them about the basement. She told them everything except the part about the dealer's blood on her hands and the revolver she'd seen Mark grab. She drove for hours, watching the sun rise higher in the sky until her phone rang, and a detective's voice on the other end told her to come to the station. She was giving her formal statement when the kidnapping happened. She had left the police station at 4 in the afternoon. The parking lot was nearly empty. As she walked toward her car, 2 men in balaclavas emerged from between the parked vehicles. One grabbed her from behind, his arm around her throat. The other pressed a damp cloth, chloroform she would later realize, over her mouth and nose. Elena kicked and clawed at the first man's face, tearing his mask slightly. She could see one eye, dark and furious. But the drug was already working. The world began to tilt and blur. Her vision tunneled. She heard her own voice screaming, but it sounded like it was coming from very far away. Then nothing. When she woke, she was tied to a metal chair in an abandoned building that smelled of rust and decay. Her head was bleeding from the temple. The pain was sharp and immediate. She tried to move and found that her wrists and ankles were bound with nylon rope, tied so tightly that her fingers had begun to go numb. A man sat in front of her. He was wearing a tailored 3-piece suit despite the hour and the location. He was methodically peeling an orange with a silver knife, the blade thin and sharp. The peel came away in long, spiraling strips. "Mark is a very resourceful man, isn't he?" the man said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Elena said nothing. She could taste blood in her mouth. The man pulled a phone from his pocket and pressed play. A voice came through the speaker, Mark's voice, desperate and high-pitched. "Take my wife. She knows where the stash is. Just leave me alone. I gave you her location at the docks." The recording ended. The man, Victor, she would later learn, smiled thinly and placed the phone back in his pocket. "No," Elena whispered. "He wouldn't." "He did," Victor said. He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with the tip of the cold blade. "He traded your life for a week's supply and a fresh start. Tell me where the bags are, Elena. Make this easy on yourself." Elena looked down at her wedding ring. The gold caught the light from the bare bulb hanging above them. She tried to twist it off, but the ropes were too tight. Victor's blade had cut into her skin. She could feel blood dripping down her wrist. She said nothing. Victor waited for another hour, asking the same questions over and over. When it became clear that Elena wouldn't talk, couldn't talk, even if she wanted to, because she was too busy processing the fact that Mark had orchestrated her kidnapping, he simply stood up and gestured to his men. They filed out of the room without a word. Victor locked the door from the outside. Then Elena heard the gurgling sound. It came from a pipe near the ceiling, a pipe that had been capped off years ago, probably decades. The cap had been removed. Water began to flow down, slowly at first, then faster. Elena realized what was happening. The room was going to fill with water. She thrashed against the ropes, trying desperately to free herself, but they held firm. The water rose from the floor in dark, murky waves. It was filthy. She could smell rot and chemicals and things she didn't want to identify. Dead rats floated in the corners. The water reached her ankles, then her waist, then her chest. She gasped for air, her nose barely above the rising liquid. Her throat closed in panic. She was going to die here, in this concrete box, in this dirty, cold water. "Please," she sobbed. "Not like this. Mark, you coward. Please." But Mark couldn't hear her, and no one was coming to save her. Elena looked around wildly. Her eyes caught on something, a piece of metal sticking out from the wall, rough and jagged, corroded by years of rust and moisture. It was near the top of the chair, at chest height. She couldn't reach it from a sitting position. She pivoted her body with a strength born of pure desperation and dragged the heavy metal chair through the water. The ropes cut deeper into her skin. She could feel blood running freely down her wrists now, mixing with the murky water. She positioned the chair directly beneath the metal shard and began to work the rope against the sharp edge. Back and forth. Back and forth. The rope frayed slowly, individual fibers breaking under the friction. The sound was rhythmic and endless. Rasp, rasp, rasp. Like some mechanical heartbeat counting down to her death. The water continued to rise. It was at her neck now, her chin barely above the surface. Then the rope snapped. Elena's hands flew free. She tore at the ropes binding her legs, her numb fingers struggling with the knots. The water was at her mouth. She could taste it now, foul and thick with decay. She got one leg free, then the other. She stood up in chest-deep water and looked upward. High above, barely visible in the darkness, was a small window with a broken pane. A sliver of moonlight came through it. She was shaking violently as she stacked the metal chair against the wall and climbed onto it. The chair wobbled beneath her weight. She heaved herself upward, reaching for the window. The frame was old and had deteriorated significantly. She grabbed the edges and pulled herself up, sliding through the narrow opening. The glass cut her stomach as she wriggled through. She felt blood bloom across her skin, warm and wet. Then she was falling, tumbling out into the night, landing hard on gravel. The air was cold and sharp against her wet skin. She lay there for a moment, gasping, her body shaking uncontrollably. She got to her feet. Elena walked for 3 hours before she found a gas station. The attendant there, an older man with kind eyes, gave her a blanket and called the police without asking questions. She sat in the fluorescent-lit convenience store and waited. She didn't remember giving her address. She didn't remember much of anything. When she arrived home, it was not quite 5:30 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. Mark was in the living room, frantically throwing the black duffel bags into a large trunk. His movements were jerky and panicked. He looked up when Elena appeared in the doorway, his face going pale beneath the stubble and grime that covered it. She was holding the dealer's revolver. "Elena," he cried, moving toward her. "You're alive. I followed them. I was going to save you." "Shut up, Mark," Elena said quietly. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and cold, like it was coming from someone else. "I heard the recording." Mark's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. Elena raised the gun, aiming it at his chest. Mark fell to his knees, sobbing, his hands up in front of his face in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Elena's finger hovered near the trigger. She thought about the money. She thought about the pills hidden in the floorboard. She thought about the ledger and the list of names in his careful handwriting. She thought about him trading her life for a week's supply. She thought about the water rising in the darkness. Then she lowered the gun slightly and pulled out her phone. She showed him the screen, where a call to 911 had been connected for the past 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The dispatcher's voice came through the speaker, calm and professional. "Ma'am, are you still there? Units are en route. Your position is being tracked via GPS." Mark's face crumbled. He looked at his wife, and Elena saw the moment he understood that he had already lost everything. The sirens started wailing in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights began to pulse through the windows, reflecting off the gray walls of the living room. Mark looked down at the bags surrounding him, the tangible evidence of his crimes, of his choices, of the man he had become. The police cars pulled up outside at 6 in the morning, just as the sun broke fully over the horizon. Officers moved through the house with practiced efficiency, finding the drugs in the basement, the ledger in the office, the cash hidden in a safe behind a painting in the bedroom. They found the revolver, still wet from the water in the warehouse, and they found the life insurance policy. Mark was led away in handcuffs. He screamed the whole time, calling Elena a traitor, swearing that he loved her, that he had done all of this for them. No one was listening. Elena stood on the porch, wrapped in a gray police blanket, and watched the sun rise higher. An officer handed her Mark's wallet, recovered during the search. She opened it without really thinking about it. Her wedding photo was inside, both of them young and smiling, captured in a moment when she had believed his lies without reservation. Behind the photo was a small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly. It was a life insurance policy, recently updated. The beneficiary line was highlighted in yellow. Victor Rosso. Elena read it twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Then she looked at the signature at the bottom. Mark Evans, written in his careful, familiar handwriting. He had taken out a life insurance policy on her with another man as the beneficiary. He had made her death valuable, not to him, to Victor, to the man who now owed him money for the betrayal, for the setup, for the wife he had delivered like a package. Elena's face didn't move. She felt the muscles twitch slightly at the corner of her mouth, and then nothing. She slipped the ring off her finger, that gold circle that she had worn for so many years, that had meant so many things, and walked to the storm drain at the end of the driveway. She held it over the metal grate for a moment, looking at it catch the morning light one last time. Then she let it fall. It clinked against the metal grate and disappeared into the darkness below. Elena turned around and walked back into the house. She closed the door firmly behind her, and she didn't look back. The door locked with a heavy, decisive click. Inside, the house was quiet and still. She stood in the hallway, looking at the scattered coats that still lay across the floor from that morning's struggle. The morning that felt like a lifetime ago, though less than 24 hours had passed. Elena climbed the stairs to the bedroom. She opened the closet and pulled out a large leather suitcase. It was the kind she had used for vacations, for trips she had taken with Mark, back when she believed that trips to mountain towns and beach resorts could make up for all the small betrayals, all the small lies, all the small moments when she had chosen to ignore what she was really seeing. She filled the suitcase with clothes. Not her best clothes, just the ones she would need. A few pairs of jeans, shirts, underwear, socks. She placed the suitcase on the bed and closed it. She took it downstairs and set it by the front door. Then she took one last look at the house. The living room was still scattered with evidence of Mark's escape attempt. the large trunk sitting empty, coats in the hallway, papers scattered on tables. The kitchen still had the coffee cup sitting on the counter, the coffee inside cold and congealed. The office still had the desk with the broken lock and the empty space where the ledger had been. Elena looked at all of it and felt nothing. Not rage, not sorrow, not even satisfaction. Just a profound and overwhelming emptiness, as if something essential had been removed from her and she had become hollow. She picked up the suitcase handle. She walked to the front door and turned the brass knob. The door swung open and the morning air rushed in, cool and clean and full of possibility that felt like a lie. Elena stepped out onto the porch. Behind her, the house stood quiet in the morning light, with its perfectly manicured lawn and its professionally painted trim and its interior that had hidden so many secrets. She descended the porch steps one at a time. Her footsteps on the concrete walk were steady and measured. She didn't rush. She didn't hurry. She simply walked to the gate, opened it, and stepped through onto the sidewalk. The street was empty. It was still early morning, and most of the neighbors were still sleeping. She walked without knowing where she was going. She walked for 20 minutes, pulling the suitcase behind her, until she reached a bus stop. She sat on the bench and waited. When the bus came, Elena boarded it without looking back at the neighborhood she was leaving behind. She took a seat by the window and watched the streets pass. The bus carried her downtown, toward the train station, toward the highway, toward anywhere that was not that house and not this life. She had no plan beyond leaving. She had no destination in mind. But as the bus moved through the waking city, past parks and shops and the homes of people who had never known her and would never know her, Elena felt something shift inside her. Not peace, not closure, not any of the words people used when they talked about healing. Just the small, hard kernel of certainty that she had chosen. That whatever came next, she had chosen it. And that made it bearable. The bus turned the corner and carried her forward into the morning.